As I walked, my son left me in the woods, until someone appeared. I thought it would be my end, alone in the cold and silence of abandonment. But when a stranger lifted me from the ground, I realized I could still live. And there, between abandonment and misery, was born the love that my own blood had denied me. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. George observed the afternoon sun illuminating the small living room, where the silence weighed more than his 70 years. Sitting in his favorite armchair, the one that bore the marks of time just like his body, he leafed through an album of photographs yellowed by time. His wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he passed through each image that told the story of a life that seemed increasingly distant. "Dad, let's go for a walk." Robert's voice, his only son, cut through the silence like a sharp blade. There was no affection in those words, just a disguised urgency that George, in his elderly wisdom, managed to perceive. "Now, it's almost time for my show," George replied without taking his eyes off the photographs. "It's important. I found a place you'll like, beautiful scenery, fresh air. It'll do you good to get out of this house a bit." George slowly closed the album. That sudden invitation awakened a dormant hope in him. Perhaps finally, Robert was trying to rebuild the bonds that had worn down since the departure of Helen, his wife, 3 years ago. Loneliness had become his faithful companion since then, even though he shared the roof with his son. "All right, I'll just get my coat." The journey was silent. Robert kept his eyes fixed on the road, while George watched the city fall behind. The buildings gave way to more spaced-out houses, then to small farms, until only trees remained around them. The car entered a dirt road, and George's heart accelerated without him understanding why. "Is it still far?" he asked, noting that they had been on the road for almost an hour. "We've arrived," Robert answered dryly, stopping the car near a clearing. "Let's walk a bit. The view is just past those trees." George got out of the car with difficulty. His knees protested against the effort, but he didn't complain. He was willing to do anything to regain his son's attention. They walked for a few minutes, the silence interrupted only by birdsong and the sound of their steps on dry leaves. "Robert, I think we better go back. It's getting late and my legs—" "Sit over there on that rock, Dad. I'll get water from the car." George obeyed, feeling the fatigue weighing on his shoulders. He sat down and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool breeze caress his face. When he opened them again, he was alone, completely alone. "Robert," he called, his voice echoing among the trees. There was no response. "Robert," he shouted louder, rising with difficulty. He staggered back along the path they had traveled, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. When he reached where the car should have been, he found only tire marks in the dirt. Understanding fell on him like a crushing weight. Robert had abandoned him there in the middle of nowhere. The following hours were a blur of despair. George wandered through the woods, shouting for his son, begging for help, until his voice failed and his legs gave way. Night came quickly, bringing with it a cold that penetrated his bones and a primitive fear he hadn't felt since childhood. Huddled under a tree, he fought against tears. How could his own son do this? What had he done to deserve such cruelty? The questions spun in his mind like an endless carousel, preventing him from sleeping, even when fatigue begged for rest. Dawn found him dehydrated and hungry. With difficulty, George got to his feet, determined to find help. His body ached, protesting against every movement, but something inside him refused to give up. He followed what appeared to be a trail, stumbling on roots and stones, until the sound of running water reached his ears. It was as he approached a small stream that he saw her for the first time. A woman with graying hair was collecting water in a plastic bottle. Her appearance was simple, worn clothes and a face marked by the sun, but there was a dignity in her posture that impressed him. "Help," George managed to say, his voice barely audible. The woman turned around startled, dropping the bottle. For a moment, they stared at each other, two strangers united by the surprise of an unexpected encounter. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, recovering from the shock. "No, my son, he left me here yesterday." The woman frowned, confused. "Left you? What do you mean?" "He said we were going to see some scenery. Then he disappeared with the car." A long silence followed as the woman digested that information. Then, without asking more questions, she offered her own water bottle. "Drink slowly. My name is Catherine." George, he replied after quenching his most urgent thirst. Come with me, George. I have a shelter not far from here. It's not much, but it has shade and I can give you something to eat. George hesitated. Trusting strangers had never been his strong suit, but what choice did he have now? He nodded and followed Catherine along a narrow trail. They walked for nearly 20 minutes before a small improvised shelter appeared among the trees. It was made of tarps, wood, and other materials that Catherine had clearly collected. It wasn't a house, not by a long shot, but at that moment it seemed like a palace to George. Sit down, she indicated a small bench made of logs. I'll prepare something for us to eat. While Catherine moved with familiarity around the limited space, George observed everything around him. There was a surprising organization in that apparent chaos. Utensils carefully hung, a small garden in cut cans, even books stacked on an improvised shelf. You live here? He asked, still incredulous. For almost 5 years, Catherine replied, while cutting homemade bread. Not by choice initially, but now it's my home. George accepted the bread and some tea that she offered. He ate in silence, feeling the warmth of the drink restore some of his hope. When he finished, he felt strong enough to ask the question that burned in his mind. How can I get back to the city? Catherine studied him for a moment, her dark, penetrating eyes as if they could see beyond his words. The nearest town is a day's walk away, but you don't seem in any condition to make that journey now. Why don't you rest here today? Tomorrow I can show you the way to the main road where some trucks pass by. The offer was tempting, and George found himself accepting before even thinking about the implications. Spending a night there, in that strange shelter with a woman he had just met, seemed surreal. But as he lay down that night on an improvised mattress that Catherine had prepared, George felt a strange peace. The abandonment still hurt like an open wound, but there was something in the simplicity of that place, and in Catherine's unexpected kindness, that brought a comfort he hadn't expected to find. Before falling asleep, he observed his hostess through the weak light of a lantern. She quietly arranged her things, her face serene despite the circumstances that life had imposed on her. There was a story there, George could feel it, and for the first time since he had been abandoned, he felt curiosity about something beyond his own pain. Why are you here? He asked softly. Catherine stopped what she was doing and looked at him. A small, sad smile formed on her lips. That's a long story, George, perhaps for another day. And with those words, she extinguished the lantern, letting the night envelop the small shelter. In the dark, George felt a tear run down his face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, if he would be able to return home, or if his son would ever regret what he had done. But at that moment, under the improvised roof of a stranger who had offered him more kindness in a few hours than his family had in years, he allowed himself to rest. The first rays of sunlight infiltrated through the cracks of the shelter when George awoke. For a moment, confusion took hold of him. Where was he? Why didn't he recognize the ceiling above his head? Then, like a wave, the memories of the previous day hit him. The walk, the abandonment, Catherine. He sat up on the improvised mattress, feeling pain in parts of his body he didn't even know existed. Good morning. Catherine's voice sounded calm. She was already up, tending to something that looked like a small stove. Did you sleep well? Considering the circumstances, George replied, trying to get up. His joints protested, and a groan escaped his lips. Slowly, Catherine approached, offering support. Your body isn't used to sleeping like this. Here, I made a tea that will help with the pain. George accepted the steaming mug, surprised by the pleasant aroma. What is this? Herbs that I grow. I learned from my grandmother, who was a healer back in rural Kentucky. The tea went down hot through George's throat, bringing immediate relief. As he drank, he observed Catherine moving around the small space. There was a grace in her movements, a dignity that contrasted with the precariousness around them. You said you could show me the way to the town today, George commented after a long silence. Catherine stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her face assuming a serious expression. I can. But first, I need to ask, are you sure you want to go back? The question caught George by surprise. What do you mean? Of course I want to go back. I have my house, my belongings, and the son who abandoned you here. Her words, though soft, hit George like a punch. The truth hurt more when spoken aloud. Robert, he must be sorry now. He probably went back to get me and couldn't find me. Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat next to him on the mattress, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Do you know why I live here, George? It wasn't a choice, as I said yesterday. I was kicked out of my own home by my husband and my children. I was 58, had worked my whole life as a teacher. When I retired, my husband decided he didn't need me anymore. I discovered he had another family, another life. When I confronted my children, they took their father's side. They said I was going crazy, making up stories." George felt a lump in his throat. Catherine's story echoed his own pain in a way he hadn't expected. "How did you survive?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "At first, I stayed in shelters. Then, on the streets. I met people, learned to collect recyclables. One day I got tired of the city, the noise, the looks. I came here and built this," she gestured around. "It's not much, but it's mine. No one looks at me with pity or contempt here." The silence that followed was laden with mutual understanding. Two people who had been discarded by those who should have loved them unconditionally. "I still want to go back," George finally said. "I need to understand why Robert did this." Catherine nodded. "I understand. I'll show you the way after breakfast. But know that you can come back if you want. Sometimes what we think is our home is nothing but a prison." Breakfast was simple. More bread, fruit that Catherine had gathered in the surroundings, and a boiled egg that she meticulously divided in two. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterwards, Catherine guided him along a trail that wound between the trees. George walked slowly, occasionally leaning on the arm she offered. The forced intimacy of the situation created a strange familiarity between them. "How do you manage to live so isolated?" George asked during a rest break. "I'm not completely isolated. I go to town twice a week to sell what I grow and collect recyclable materials. I know some people there who help me when I need it. And I have my books," she smiled. "I've always been an avid reader. When everything collapsed, it was books that kept me sane." The trail eventually led them to a wider dirt road. Catherine pointed to the horizon. "Follow this path for about 2 miles. You'll reach a state highway. From there you can hitchhike to town." George looked at the path ahead, then at the woman who had taken him in. There was something about her that intrigued him, a quiet strength that he admired. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything." "No need to thank me. Just remember, sometimes what seems like an end may just be a new beginning." With those words, she turned to return to her shelter. George watched her for a moment before starting his journey down the dirt road. Each step brought him closer to civilization, to answers, to confrontations he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. The sun was already high when George spotted the highway. His feet hurt, and thirst tightened his throat. He sat by the roadside waiting for a vehicle to pass. 1 hour passed, then another. Cars and trucks occasionally passed, but none stopped for the elderly man who desperately waved. As the day progressed, George's determination began to falter. What if no one stopped? What if, even reaching the city, he found only more rejection? The house he shared with Robert had not been a home since Helen's departure. It was just a space where two strangers coexisted in silence. When the sun began to set, George made a decision. He got up, adjusted his worn coat, and began to walk, not toward the city, but back to Catherine's shelter. Each step was both painful and liberating. He was choosing a path he had never imagined for himself, but for the first time in a long time it was his own choice. Night had already fallen when he finally spotted the small glow of Catherine's lantern among the trees. He approached slowly, almost fearfully. What if she didn't want him back? What if her offer had been mere courtesy? "George?" Catherine appeared at the entrance of the shelter, surprise evident on her face. "What happened? Couldn't get a ride?" "I could have, eventually," he replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "But I realized I have nowhere to go back to." "Not really." Catherine studied him for a long moment, then opened a smile that illuminated her tired face. "Well, then I guess I need to teach you how to build your own bed. This one we improvised last night won't hold up for long." That night marked the beginning of a new phase in George's life. Lying on the same improvised mattress, listening to Catherine's soft breathing from the other side of the small shelter, he allowed himself to think about the future for the first time since he had been abandoned. It wouldn't be easy to adapt to this new life he knew. His body, accustomed to comfort, would protest, but there was something liberating in the simplicity, in the raw honesty of this place. "Catherine?" he called softly in the darkness. "Yes," her voice responded, showing no sign of sleep. "Did you ever want to go back? Confront your family?" A long silence followed, so prolonged that George thought she had fallen asleep. Finally, her voice sounded low and full of contained emotion. "Every day at the beginning, I planned speeches, imagined their expressions when they saw me strong, independent. But over time, I realized that true power isn't in making others regret, but in no longer needing their approval to be happy." Catherine's words stayed with George as he fell asleep. In his dreams, he saw himself younger, walking down an unknown road, Helen by his side, laughing at something he had said. The dream was sweet, but unlike the other times he had dreamed of his wife, waking up didn't bring that sharp stab of pain. Instead, he felt a strange peace. The following days were a dive into a completely new world for George. Catherine taught him to identify edible plants, to repair the roof of the shelter when it rained, to light a fire even on damp days. He, in turn, contributed with his own skills. He fixed the small battery-powered radio she had, improved the rainwater collection system, organized a more efficient garden. Living together wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension, necessary adjustments. George sometimes got irritated with Catherine's stubbornness, while she occasionally lost patience with his slowness to learn certain tasks. But there was also laughter, stories shared by the light of the lantern, a companionship that neither had experienced in years. A month passed like this in a routine that surprisingly brought comfort to George. It was then that Catherine invited him to accompany her to town for the first time. "It's time for you to know the other side of my world," she said, as they prepared for the walk. "There, I'm not the woman who teaches you about plants or fixes the roof. I'm just another collector, invisible to most people." Her warning became clear when they reached the limits of the small town. Catherine's behavior changed subtly. Her shoulders curved a little, her gaze lowered, as if she wanted to occupy less space. George felt a wave of protection that surprised him. They walked together through the streets, Catherine pulling her handcart, George helping to collect recyclable materials. The looks they received ranged from contempt to pity, rarely reaching respect. For George, accustomed to being treated with a certain deference due to his age, it was a humiliating experience. "How do you bear this?" he asked softly, after a woman pulled her daughter away from them, as if they were contagious. "I learned to see beyond the looks," Catherine replied simply. "That woman doesn't know me. She doesn't know I was a teacher for 30 years, that I've read more books than she probably will see in her entire life. Her judgment says more about her than about me." That day, George began to see Catherine with different eyes. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a woman of extraordinary inner strength, someone who had transformed abandonment into independence, rejection into freedom. As they returned to the shelter at the end of the day, tired but with the cart full of useful materials and a few dollars obtained from the sale of recyclables, George felt that something had changed within him. The initial shame had been replaced by a strange pride. They were building something together from nothing, counting only on each other. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, noticing his silence as they prepared dinner. "About how unpredictable life is," George replied, looking at his hands now calloused from manual labor. "I never imagined that at 70 I would be living like this. And stranger still, I never imagined that I could find peace after what Robert did." Catherine smiled, that smile that he now knew so well, part wisdom, part melancholy. "You know what I've learned in all these years, George? That our greatest wounds sometimes become doors to our greatest learnings." That night, sitting side by side at the entrance of the shelter, observing the stars that shone with an impossible intensity in the city, George felt something he hadn't experienced since youth: possibility. The future, which before seemed just a painful continuation of the present, now opened in unexpected directions. 3 months had passed since George decided to stay with Catherine. The small shelter had transformed considerably in that period. With George's experience in small repairs, a skill he had developed after retiring as an accountant, and Catherine's practical knowledge, the space now had improvised partitions that ensured a minimum of privacy, a more efficient rainwater collection system, and a garden that flourished with various vegetables. That autumn morning began like so many others. Catherine prepared coffee, while George fed the chickens they had gotten through a trade with a local farmer. The sun rose lazily, filtering through the leaves of the trees and creating golden patterns on the packed earth floor. "We need to go to town today," Catherine commented, handing a cup of coffee to George. "The flower stock is running out, and we can take advantage to sell those small baskets you made." George nodded, blowing on the hot coffee. His hands, once soft and with age spots, now displayed calluses from someone who worked daily. Surprisingly, he was proud of these marks. They represented his new life, one he had chosen of his own free will. The visits to town had become less intimidating over time. George already knew some merchants who treated Catherine with respect, recognizing her honesty and hard work. There were still looks of contempt, of course, but he had learned to ignore them, just as she did. As they walked along the trail that led to the main road, George noticed that Catherine seemed worried, biting her lower lip, a habit that he knew indicated anxiety. "Something wrong?" he asked, adjusting the handcart they used to transport materials. Catherine hesitated before answering. "I heard rumors the last time I was in town. The city hall is planning a cleanup in peripheral areas, removing irregular occupations." A chill ran down George's spine. "Our shelter." "Exactly. Technically, we are in an environmental preservation area. Although I've been careful not to cause damage, we don't have authorization to be there." The rest of the way was traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The possibility of losing the home they had built together hung like a shadow over the day that had barely begun. In town, they confirmed the rumors. City Hall posters announced Operation Clean City, scheduled to begin the following month. Several residents of occupations similar to theirs were already circulating through the streets, worried and not knowing where to go. "What will we do?" George asked as they organized the recyclable materials they had collected. "For now, we continue as always," Catherine replied, her voice firm despite the concern evident in her eyes. "Maybe it's just a threat, as has happened before. If they really come, we'll think of something." The uncertainty accompanied them back to the shelter that day. During dinner, eating in silence by the light of the lantern, George observed Catherine. He had learned to read her expressions, to understand her silences. He knew that, behind the facade of calm, she was as apprehensive as he was. "You know," he began, breaking the silence, "I never properly thanked you." Catherine raised her eyes from her plate, surprised. "For what?" "For taking me in, for teaching me to live again." A slight blush colored Catherine's cheeks. "You've taught me a lot too, George. Before you arrived, I was merely surviving. Now—" She didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Both knew what was between them, a connection that transcended words, built on mutual understanding and respect. That night, lying in his improvised but surprisingly comfortable bed, George reflected on the unexpected paths of life. If someone had told him 4 months ago that he would be living in a shelter in the middle of the woods, having as a companion an ex-teacher transformed into a collector, he would have laughed at the absurdity. Now he couldn't imagine another life. His thoughts were interrupted by a noise coming from outside. He sat up, alert. Catherine had also awakened, her eyes meeting his in the penumbra. "Must be some animal," she whispered, but it wasn't. Seconds later, the fragile door of the shelter was violently opened, and a male figure staggered inside. The smell of alcohol invaded the small space. "I knew I'd find you here, Catherine." The slurred voice was laden with bitterness. "Always returning to your hole like a rat." George saw Catherine's face turn pale. She got up slowly, positioning herself between the intruder and George. "What do you want, Anthony?" Her voice was firm, but George detected a slight tremor. The man laughed, an unpleasant sound that echoed in the shelter. "What do I want? I want what's rightfully mine. You think you can abandon me after everything I did for you?" "You did nothing for me," Catherine replied, each word laden with a contained anger that George had never seen in her. "Get out of here before I call for help." Anthony stepped forward, his imposing figure blocking the little light that entered through the door. George got up too, ignoring the pain in his knees. "Who's this old man?" Anthony asked, noticing George for the first time. "Found a replacement for me, is that it?" "He's my friend," Catherine replied. "And you're invading our home?" Anthony laughed again, looking around with contempt. "Home? This is a pigsty. And soon not even that you'll have. You know why the City Hall decided to clean this area now? Because I suggested it. I have contacts there, you know. I talked about irregular occupations, about the danger they represent." George's blood froze. So the threat was real and worse, specifically directed at them. "Why?" Catherine asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Because if I can't have you back, no one else will," Anthony replied, his voice assuming a dangerously calm tone. "Think of it as my little revenge for you rejecting me." Before either could react, Anthony advanced, grabbing Catherine's arm forcefully. George, moved by a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed, intervened. Despite his age and physical fragility, he placed himself between them. "Let her go," he demanded, his voice surprisingly firm. Anthony seemed surprised for a moment, then let out a laugh. "The old man has courage, but that won't save you. In 2 weeks, all of this will be destroyed." With a brusque movement, he pushed George, who fell on the improvised table, knocking over utensils and the lantern. The fire spread quickly, reaching the fabric that served as a partition. "Anthony, stop!" Catherine shouted, running to help George while trying to extinguish the flames. The man observed the scene for a moment, a cruel smile on his face. "Looks like the cleanup started earlier than I expected." With those words, he left, leaving them to deal with the fire that was beginning to spread. George and Catherine worked frantically, using water and earth to control the flames. When they finally managed to extinguish the fire, a good part of the shelter was damaged. Exhausted and dirty with soot, they sat outside, observing the starry sky. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken concerns. "Who was he?" George finally asked. Catherine sighed deeply, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "Anthony was someone I met when I was still living on the streets. At first, he seemed kind, offered help, food, but soon I realized he wanted more than I was willing to give. When I rejected him, he showed his true nature. It was one of the reasons that led me to seek a more isolated place." George covered her hand with his, a simple gesture of comfort. "Do you believe he really influenced the City Hall's decision?" "I don't know, but it's possible. Anthony has connections, works for local politicians doing services they prefer not to associate directly with their names." The revelation brought a new dimension of concern. They weren't just facing a bureaucratic threat, but also a personal revenge. "We need a plan," George said, a determination growing inside him. "I won't allow us to lose everything we've built." Catherine looked at him, a slight smile forming on her lips despite the circumstances. "Us? So you really consider this place your home now?" "Yes," George replied without hesitation. "More than any other place I've ever lived, because here I chose to be and here I found you." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. For a moment, it seemed that Catherine was going to respond, but instead she just squeezed his hand and nodded. The next morning, they began to rebuild what had been damaged. The work was arduous, especially for George, whose body was still not completely adapted to that lifestyle, but there was a determination in him that surprised even Catherine. "I never thought that at 70 I would be rebuilding a house," he commented, as they fixed a new tarp to replace the one that had been burned. "I never thought I would have someone to help me rebuild," Catherine replied, passing him more improvised nails made of wood. They worked in silence for some time, each lost in their own thoughts. George reflected on how his life had completely changed in a few months. Robert's abandonment, which initially seemed like a sentence, now revealed itself as a new beginning. There was still pain, of course. The son who had rejected his own father would always be a wound in his heart, but alongside that pain, something new was growing, an appreciation for simplicity, for self-sufficiency, for the company of someone who understood him deeply. "Do you think we should try to regularize our situation?" he suddenly asked. "Go to City Hall, explain our situation." Catherine stopped what she was doing, considering the suggestion. "We can try, but I doubt they'll listen. For them, we are just two more invisible, inconvenient people who need to be removed to beautify the city." "And if we looked for my son?" The question caught them both by surprise. George hadn't mentioned Robert in weeks, as if the subject was taboo between them. "You want to go back to him?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No," George replied quickly, "but he has resources, contacts. Maybe he could help us find a legal place to stay, something they couldn't take from us." Catherine was silent for a long moment. "The decision is yours, George. But remember how he treated you. People who are capable of abandoning those they should love rarely change. Her words, though harsh, carried the wisdom of someone who had experienced similar betrayals. George knew she was right. Still, a part of him wondered if Robert was sorry, if he had looked for him. "Let's finish this first," he decided, indicating the partially rebuilt shelter. "Then we'll think about the next step." The following days were dedicated not just to reconstruction, but also to the elaboration of a contingency plan. If they were really forced to leave the place, where would they go? What would they take? How would they survive? It was during these discussions that George noticed a subtle change in Catherine. There were moments when she seemed distant, as if keeping a secret. Other times he caught her observing him with an expression he couldn't completely decipher, something between affection and concern. A week after the incident with Anthony, as they shared a simple dinner by the light of the new lantern they had acquired in town, Catherine finally spoke about what was worrying her. "George, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice tense. "Something about my past that you don't know." He put his plate aside, giving her his full attention. Catherine rarely talked about her past beyond what she had already shared. "Before being a teacher, before getting married, I made mistakes, serious mistakes that affected many people." George waited, without pressing. He knew that some stories needed time to be told. "I worked for an important politician in my youth. I was naive, ambitious. I did what I was asked without questioning, believing I was helping to build a better future for our city. But in reality, I was helping to divert funds that should have gone to schools, hospitals." The revelation hung between them like a dark cloud. George processed the information, trying to reconcile this new facet with the Catherine he knew, honest, compassionate, fair. "When I realized what was happening, I tried to leave, but they had evidence of my involvement, although I was just a pawn. They threatened to incriminate me if I spoke, so I made a deal, silence in exchange for my freedom. I left, moved to another city, rebuilt my life as a teacher." "And your husband, your children, did they know about this?" Catherine shook her head. "I never told anyone, until now. But I have reasons to believe that my past is coming back to haunt me." "What do you mean?" "Anthony, he didn't appear by chance. I think he was sent to find me. The politician I worked for is running for a higher office now. Any connection to past scandals would be devastating for his campaign." George's heart accelerated. It wasn't just the threat from City Hall that loomed over them, but something potentially more dangerous. "Are we in danger?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "I don't know. Maybe. That's why I need to make a difficult decision, George, and that's why I needed you to know the whole truth first." He waited, a knot forming in his throat. "Maybe it's better if we separate. You could look for your son, try a reconciliation. I would go far away, start over somewhere else." The suggestion hit George like a physical blow. The idea of losing Catherine, of returning to the loneliness he had known before, was unbearable. "No," he said, his voice firm despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I won't leave you to face this alone. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." "George, you don't understand the risk." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, taking her hands in his. "Catherine, before I met you, I merely existed. I breathed, ate, slept, but didn't really live. You showed me that there was still life in me, that I could still feel, contribute, matter to someone. I'm not giving that up. I'm not giving you up." The words, spoken with an intensity that surprised them both, hung in the air like a promise. Catherine looked at their entwined hands, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "Afraid that my past mistakes will hurt you too. And I'm afraid of losing the only person who has made me feel alive again," George replied simply. That night, sitting side by side under the stars, they made plans. Not to flee separately, but to face together whatever might come. The threat from City Hall, Catherine's past, the possible reconciliation with Robert, everything would be approached as a couple, as a family they had formed in the most unlikely circumstances. "Tomorrow we'll go to town," George decided. "We'll start with City Hall, then if necessary we'll look for Robert. And as for your past, maybe it's time to face it too." Catherine nodded slowly. "Together," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Together," George confirmed, sealing the promise with a handshake that, for both, meant much more than words could express. Morning dawned, covered by a thin fog that enveloped the woods like a protective mantle. George and Catherine prepared in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts as they gathered important documents and belongings. The plan was clear. They would first go to City Hall to try to regularize their situation. Then, regardless of the result, they would seek out Robert. "Are you ready?" Catherine asked, adjusting a colorful scarf over her graying hair. A small gesture of dignity that didn't go unnoticed by George. "As ready as I can be," he replied, trying to keep his voice firm despite the anxiety consuming him. They walked side by side to the main road, where they waited for the rural bus that passed twice a week. The old noisy vehicle would take them to town, saving the strength they would need for the challenges ahead. On the journey, sitting on the worn seats of the almost empty bus, George held Catherine's hand. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. A silent promise that regardless of what happened, they would remain together. The town seemed strangely intimidating that morning. The streets were busier than usual, with banners announcing a political rally that would take place in the central square. George felt Catherine stiffen beside him when they passed a particularly large poster. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Theodore Miller, the man I worked for." George observed the smiling face on the poster, a middle-aged man, graying hair at the temples, confident smile of someone used to having everything he wants. "Candidate for governor," he read aloud. "Honesty and experience at the service of the people." "Ironic, isn't it?" Catherine commented, an unusual bitterness in her voice. They diverted from the main square, heading to City Hall. The imposing building, with its neoclassical facade, seemed out of place in that small, rural town. They climbed the steps slowly, George leaning on the railing to relieve the weight on his painful knees. Inside, they were greeted with looks of distrust. Their simple clothes and worn appearance clashed with the bureaucratic environment. After a long wait, they were finally attended to by an employee with a bored expression. "We would like to talk about the situation of our shelter," Catherine began, her teacher's voice emerging naturally. "It's located in the preservation area, but—" "Ah, yes, Operation Clean City," the employee interrupted without raising her eyes from the papers. "All irregular occupations will be removed next week. There's nothing to discuss." "But we've lived there for years," Catherine insisted. "We take care of the place, don't cause environmental damage. We have a garden, collect rainwater." "Ma'am," the employee finally looked at them, impatience evident on her face. "It doesn't matter if you plant flowers or collect water. It's an irregular occupation in a preservation area. The law is clear." George felt frustration growing inside him. How could they be so easily discarded? How could their lives be reduced to a bureaucratic issue to be resolved with a simple removal? "Is there any alternative?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "Some housing program we could sign up for?" The employee sighed as if the question was a nuisance. "There's a waiting list of years for social housing, and you would need complete documentation, proof of income, a series of requirements." They left City Hall defeated. The sun was already high in the sky, merciless above their heads as they walked aimlessly through the streets of the town. "And now?" Catherine asked, her voice tired. "Now we're going to look for Robert," George replied, renewed determination in his eyes. "Not to ask him to take me back, but to confront him with the consequences of his actions." The house where George had lived most of his adult life was in a quiet residential neighborhood. Well-kept gardens, low fences, a middle-class atmosphere that now seemed strangely artificial to him. They stopped in front of the green gate, George feeling his heart accelerate. "Are you sure?" Catherine asked softly. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," he replied, pressing the doorbell before his courage wavered. Long seconds passed before the door opened. Robert appeared, wearing an apron, flour on his hands. He was cooking, something George had never seen him do. His face transformed into a mask of shock upon recognizing his father. "Dad?" The word came out as an incredulous whisper. You're alive?" The question hit George like a physical blow. "Surprisingly, yes, despite your best efforts." Robert shook his head, genuine confusion on his face. "I went back to get you the same day you had disappeared. I searched the entire clearing, called the police. They said you had probably been attacked by wild animals or fallen down some ravine." It was George's turn to be confused. "You came back?" "Of course I came back. I just needed some time to think. I was overwhelmed taking care of you, the house, work. It was a moment of weakness, of despair. I never meant to abandon you permanently." A heavy silence fell between them, laden with unspoken accusations, insufficient explanations, late regrets. "Robert?" A female voice sounded from inside the house. "Who is it?" A young woman appeared beside Robert, a baby in her arms. She looked at George, then at Catherine, curiosity in her eyes. "My God," she suddenly exclaimed. "You're George, Robert's father." George nodded, still absorbing the scene before him. A baby. His son had a baby. He was a grandfather and didn't know it. "I'm Anna," the woman introduced herself, a genuine smile illuminating her face. "And this is little Helen, your granddaughter. She's 6 months old." "Little Helen?" George repeated, feeling emotion tighten his throat. Helen, the name of his wife. "Robert told me so much about you and your wife," Anna continued, seeming not to notice the tension between father and son. "Please, come in. We were about to have lunch." Before they could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion in the street. Several people were running toward the main square, excited voices commenting on something they couldn't distinguish. "What's going on?" Robert asked a passing neighbor. "Political scandal. Someone leaked compromising documents about Theodore Miller. They're saying he diverted millions from education years ago. It's all over the internet now." Catherine turned pale, grabbing George's arm tightly. "It can't be a coincidence," she whispered. "Someone decided to expose the truth right now." The revelation created a moment of decision. Should they enter Robert's house, try to rebuild family ties, ignoring the new crisis that was unfolding, or should Catherine face her past once and for all? "We need to go to the square," Catherine said, her voice firm despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I need to see this with my own eyes." Robert and Anna looked at each other confused. "Dad, who is this lady?" George straightened his shoulders, a new confidence in his posture. "This is Catherine, my companion, the woman who saved me when I was abandoned and taught me to live again." The explicit recognition of their relationship seemed to surprise even Catherine, who looked at him with emotion in her eyes. "We can talk later," George continued. "Now, we need to resolve another urgent situation." The central square was packed when they arrived. A crowd was gathered around an improvised screen where documents, photos, bank transfer receipts were being displayed, irrefutable evidence of a corruption scheme that had drained resources destined for public education 2 decades ago. Theodore Miller was on the stage, face red with fury, trying to deny the accusations while nervous advisors whispered around him. It was then that he saw Catherine in the crowd. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and George could see recognition followed by fear on the politician's face. "It's her!" Miller suddenly pointed, his voice amplified by the microphone. "Catherine Rogers! She was my secretary at the time. If there's any culprit, it's her. She manipulated the documents. She made the transfers." The crowd turned to look at Catherine, who remained motionless, the dignity in her posture contrasting with Miller's uncontrolled panic. "It's true," she said, her voice calm despite not being amplified. "I worked for him, and yes, I processed documents following his direct orders." A murmur ran through the crowd. George squeezed Catherine's hand, offering silent support. "But I have something to say," she continued, walking toward the stage. Surprisingly, the crowd made way for her. "Something I've kept for 20 years." Someone passed a microphone to her. Catherine accepted it with steady hands, facing Theodore Miller directly. "I worked for this man when I was young and naive, believing I was serving the public good. When I discovered the truth about the diversion of funds, he threatened me. He said that if I spoke, I would be incriminated. I fled, rebuilt my life as a teacher, dedicating myself to fixing some of the harm that I had involuntarily helped to cause." The crowd listened in silence, hypnotized by the quiet strength that emanated from this simple-looking woman. "I don't know who revealed these documents today, but it wasn't me. Perhaps it was someone with more courage than I had. But now, finally, I can confirm, all this is true, and I have more." From her worn bag, Catherine removed a small flash drive. "Here are copies of documents I preserved as life insurance, recordings, emails, direct orders that prove that Theodore Miller not only diverted resources from education, but also from hospitals and social programs." Chaos ensued. Journalists advanced to try to obtain the flash drive. Security guards tried to protect Miller, who now looked like a defeated man. In the midst of the confusion, George managed to get Catherine out of the crowd, taking her to a quieter corner of the square. "How did you manage to keep that flash drive all these years?" he asked, admiring her foresight. "I always knew this day might come," she replied simply. "I never imagined it would be today, but I was always prepared." Robert and Anna found them minutes later, both looking stunned by the events. "I think we have a lot to talk about," Robert said, looking hesitantly at his father. "Please come back with us to the house." Lunch at Robert's house was a surreal experience. Sitting at the table where George had eaten for decades, now as visitors, they shared a meal while trying to rebuild burned bridges and understand new relationships. "I never meant to abandon you permanently," Robert repeated, guilt evident on his face. "It was a moment of weakness, of despair. When I met Anna, when we found out about the pregnancy, I was overwhelmed. Taking care of you, the housework, preparing everything for the baby's arrival." "So you decided to get rid of the easiest problem to eliminate," George completed, no rancor in his voice, just stating a fact. "Yes," Robert admitted, the shame evident. "It was unforgivable, I know. When I went back to get you a few hours later and couldn't find you, I panicked. I searched everywhere, called the police. For weeks we scoured the area. Eventually they declared that you probably hadn't survived." Anna, who was gently rocking little Helen in her lap, intervened. "He never forgave himself, George. There's a photo of you in every room of this house. He tells little Helen stories about you every night." George looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in years. He saw the deep, dark circles under his eyes, the prematurely grey hair, the signs of a man consumed by guilt. He felt no satisfaction with this suffering, just a sad understanding of how emotional wounds can destroy lives as easily as any physical disease. "What happened to you?" Robert finally asked. "How did you survive? How did you meet Catherine?" And so, between plates of homemade food and occasional interruptions from the baby, George and Catherine told their story. The providential encounter, the shelter in the woods, the new life they had built together. With each shared detail, George realized something extraordinary. What had begun as a tragedy had transformed into the greatest adventure of his life. "You really live like that? By choice?" Anna asked, fascination in her voice. "Without electricity? Without running water?" "We have what we need," Catherine replied with a smile, "and we discovered that what's necessary is much less than we imagined." The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. Robert answered, listened for a few moments, then extended the device to Catherine. "It's for you. A reporter from the local newspaper." The next hours were a succession of phone calls, visits from journalists, and eventually police investigators. Catherine's courage in confronting her past and exposing the truth about Theodore Miller had transformed her into a local heroine. Her face, once invisible to society, now graced newspapers and news programs. "What will happen to our shelter?" George asked, when they finally had a moment of tranquility as evening fell. They were sitting on Robert's porch, watching the first stars appear in the sky. "City Hall contacted me," Catherine replied, still seeming stunned by the day's events. "Apparently, Operation Clean City has been suspended indefinitely after the revelation that it was part of a larger scheme by Theodore Miller. He was planning to clean specific areas for a real estate project that would benefit his allies." Robert, who had joined them on the porch with a tray of coffee, added, "You are welcome to stay here, you know. The house has enough space. Little Helen would love to get to know her grandfather better." The invitation hung in the air, laden with possibilities. George looked at Catherine, a silent question in his eyes. She smiled softly, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you, Robert," George replied, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "But I think our home is elsewhere now. We can visit, of course, get to know little Helen better, rebuild our relationship, but the shelter, it's where we belong." "Even with all the comfort you could have here?" Anna asked, genuinely curious, as she joined them with the sleeping baby in her arms. "True comfort doesn't come from material things," Catherine replied, her voice soft. "It comes from living authentically according to your values, from having purpose, from loving and being loved unconditionally. Besides," George added with a smile, "our shelter is about to become much more than it was." In the days that followed, the story of George and Catherine continued to capture the public's imagination. A young local videographer visited the shelter, filmed their simple but dignified lives, and published the video online. The repercussion was immediate and extraordinary. Donations began to arrive, not just money but building materials, tools, seeds for the garden. Volunteers appeared on weekends, offering labor to improve the structure of the shelter without compromising its essence or autonomy. "What will we do with all this?" George asked, watching in wonder as a group of architecture students installed solar panels on the reinforced roof. "We'll share," Catherine replied simply, "just as they shared with us." And so was born the New Beginning project. The small shelter in the woods expanded, transforming into a reception center for elderly people in vulnerable situations. Simple but dignified houses were built in harmony with nature, using sustainable techniques. A community garden flourished, providing fresh food for all residents and for needy families in the region. George, with his experience in accounting, managed the donations and resources. Catherine, resuming her vocation as a teacher, coordinated literacy and environmental awareness workshops. Together, they transformed a personal tragedy into a movement of solidarity that inspired more and more people. Robert and Anna became frequent visitors, bringing little Helen to spend weekends with her grandfather and Grandma Kate, as the little one spontaneously began to call her. The relationship between father and son, although still marked by the scars of the past, found a new balance based on mutual respect and love for the child that united them. On a particularly serene afternoon, as they watched the sunset sitting on rustic benches made by volunteers, George held Catherine's hand, feeling the texture of her skin, now marked not only by age, but by daily work on the land. "You know," he said, his voice tranquil, "when Robert abandoned me in that clearing, I thought it was the end, that there was nothing more for me in this life. And look at us now," Catherine completed, her gaze traversing the small paradise they had created together. "Who would have thought that our greatest sufferings would lead us to our greatest purpose? And to our greatest love," George added, leaning in to gently kiss Catherine's lips, a gesture that had become natural between them, but that still carried the magic of the unexpected. That night, as the community gathered for the communal dinner that had become tradition, a young reporter preparing a story about the project asked George what was the secret to restarting life at 70. "There is no secret," he replied, looking fondly at Catherine, who was organizing the neighborhood children in an orderly line to serve themselves. "Just the courage to accept that endings are also beginnings, and that it's never too late to find purpose and love." The reporter asked a few more questions, but George was no longer paying full attention. His eyes were fixed on Catherine, on the extraordinary woman that fate had placed in his path in the most unlikely manner. In the corner of his mind he thought of Helen, not with sadness but with gratitude for all the shared years, and with the certainty that she would approve of this new life he had built. "Come, George," Catherine called, smiling. "Mrs. Judy brought that cassava cake you love." And he went with slow but determined steps toward the future he had never imagined, but that now he wouldn't trade for anything in this world. The end of the story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of George and Catherine has touched your hearts. To follow this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories. Find it here, clicking to your left. If you like this narrative of overcoming and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the bonds that unite us as human beings. Don't miss our upcoming content. We are eager to read your comments.